Okay, hey, so my name is Ryan Moore. I'm an engineer at MX. We're a financial technology company located here in Utah, in Lehi. And I am a React engineer there and also do some engineering management. And here with me today, I have some musicians that are going to be helping me out. I've got Steve Ricks, Christian Asplin, Stuart Wheeler, and Eric Larson. And one other thing I wanted to talk about myself is that for the last year, primarily with a coworker of mine, Marcus Manond, we've been volunteering with the Utah Refugee Education Training Center. And we've been teaching refugees coding. We've been focusing on the Java programming language as well as computer science fundamentals. If that's something that you're interested in, or you'd like to talk a little bit more about how we as programmers can share some of the skills that we have, particularly with those who are less privileged or don't have the same access that we do, please come talk to me. And if you want to talk about experimental music afterwards or the component life cycles or really anything, please do. React Rally is one of my favorite conferences, and mainly that's the spirit that all the attendees bring to it. And I'd love to meet more of you and become friends. So what's going to be going on today is I've written a little service that helps log and store React lifecycle methods as they're being triggered, and then publishes them over WebSockets, and in turn is transmitted to these fine people over here who will be doing experimental, improvisational, thematic, structured improvisation over that. And so I'm calling the piece The Wolf and the Life Cycles, and I guess that kind of makes me the wolf and these life cycles, but we can negotiate it later. We didn't. This is a little bit of odd territory probably for most of you. So I want to talk a little bit about just experimental music at a pretty high level so that there's no system shock. But experimental music, I think at its core, is music where the outcome is itself unsure. And so today, there's going to be elements of improvisation. They're not going to be playing tonal music that is laid out strictly in an imperative fashion from start to end, right? Often, the experimental music involves interesting and challenging notation. So the notation today is the WebSocket events that are being published and displayed on the iPads in front of them. And yes, I did decide to write an application that relies on WebSocket events at a conference, and hopefully my phone tethering can stand up to it. So far, it's been good. Also, experimental music tends to embrace structure and chaos in some way or another, and it's a hell of a lot of fun. And so that's sort of it at a high level. We'll get into it a little bit more. And the structure for the rest of the talk is I'm going to introduce an experimental piece that's been important to me, both in terms of how I've kind of internalized the way that I view the world, some of how I view code, some of how I view people management. Some of these pieces are pretty radical in the way that they organize both sound and humans, and I think that we can learn a lot from them, and hopefully this will be some information that is pretty new and exciting to all of y'all. Then I'll introduce a couple of component lifecycle methods, talk a bit about their programming, introduce the composition notes, demonstrate them, and then at the end we'll do the premiere of the piece. Assuming all goes well. And if it doesn't, it's experimental music, so I've already won. All right? Okay, so I also want to talk at a high level about I'm asking you to dedicate quite a bit of time right now to component lifecycle methods, which are a core API of React, right? And so you may be thinking is this really worth it? Should I be thinking about this stuff? Isn't there more exciting stuff? And what I'd like to say about that is, as programmers, we should really be comfortable and familiar with the core APIs of the technologies that we use. And whether we're starting out or whether we're experienced, it's always good to plug a little bit deeper and maybe look at things sideways. And the reason is that if we use the APIs that we're presented with appropriately, then we can guarantee a consistent and safe experience for our users, right? And then also, if we know them well, we can know when to subvert them and take over, right? When we need to make something happen, we know how to fight the APIs that are given to us in a way that also we can understand the dangers that we're experiencing and how to mitigate them when we need to. So this is my little service, and I'm going to start by talking about my first experimental piece of the day. So this piece is called Cobra, and it's by a composer named John Zorn. And I've got a quote for each of these composers, and I'm going to bump this up a titch. So we'll see how my responsive design responds to bumping that up. Okay, so this is from John Zorn, and he's talking here about the piece Cobra, which is a card game that musicians play with cards and sound. And he says, ultimately, I'm the best prompter there can be, because then I can be a complete fascist. Only someone who really knows the rules can be a good prompter, someone who's extremely hyper, omni-attentive, and can make split-second decisions when 3 people are raising their hands and each one wants something different. A lot of times people make calls that I know are going to end up in a train wreck, and I have to know when to say no. So that gives you a little bit of an example of sort of the tenor of this piece. Here's what the score looks like. So if you're familiar with music at all, traditional Western musical notation, art music notation, doesn't look like this, right? And the first thing that we can see here is that traditional Western art music really proceeds in an imperative fashion. Note after note is notated exactly at the time it should occur. Performers are given very little leeway over what pitches they choose. Even many times, things beyond the pitches is notated and removed from the performer's freedom to improvise on. Dynamics, the volume, the tempo, even textures. But so another interesting thing about this piece is that it's really unpublished. And so you can find stuff like this pretty easily online, but good luck playing Cobra with just this, right? So Cobra's been taught through oral tradition from John Zorn to every single person who's played it. And so Christian taught it to me years ago, and that's how I learned how to play it. And that is a really interesting method where here even the distribution of the music is itself disrupting the delivery system that is built into the music industry. So it's a card game. It has a prompter that's like a conductor, and they basically show cards, and then players improvise around these. And there's even a point where you can put on a headband and do guerrilla tactics and like take over the game. And so some of the like takebacks that I've got out of this, well, first off, this is a real hoot to see in person because cards are flying, people are putting on things, like there's cut motions, there's eye signals and ear signals, and it's crazy. It's really dynamic. Some of the notes that the takeaways that I've had from this and sort of the parallels is that if you look at this, this is somewhat declarative in nature in the terms of how the notation itself works, right? We don't get a sense of time, and the cards are all linked with symbols that are descriptions of the improvisations that should take place. For example, cartoon trades is when a sound gets passed around from performer to performer, right? But when the piece actually starts, the imperative nature of the piece comes back. Cards are played one at a time. In order to take things over, guerrilla tactics have to insert themselves like into basically the iteration that's being played. And I also wanted to talk about the structure of this piece because while it's really sort of experimental in terms of the sound that's used, it has a top-down hierarchical militaristic system where there's a conductor, people playing the parts that they're assigned, which is often the way that corporate structures are set up. There's a very militaristic, hierarchical, even like mob-like situation with lieutenants and capos, and I think that there's ways that we can subvert that as well. So let's get into some music. So we're going to introduce a few life cycle methods. So first off, we've got our constructor. Y'all all know about this. Basically, what you want to do here is initialize local state. You can bind event handlers if you need to, and you kind of want to avoid just about anything else. A lot of the notes about these are kind of more what to avoid or what is unsafe. But yeah, initializing state, binding event handlers, that will keep you in good company. And so now, let's talk about our composition. This is going to be our constructor. It's shared, it's called once, and we're looking for optimistic, triumphant, bold, legato, and loud lines. And I'm going to just prompt this one, so we're good. And... All right, what'd you think? Okay, so here's our next one. ComponentToMount, another shared improvisation. All the shared improvisations are signaled by a circle. And we're looking here for settled, breath-oriented, airy themes. And I'll conduct both the entrance and the exit here. Excellent. From a programming standpoint, ComponentToMount doesn't have parameters. It's a great place to do any initialization work that needs DOM nodes to be present. So animations, it's also a great place to do data fetching. And you can even call set state and remember that will trigger an additional render before the first paint. Component did catch. This is one of my favorite ones, both in terms of the programmatic nature and the sounds we're going to hear. But we've got two parameters, error and info. And basically, we can set state after an error has occurred in a child component. And a good thing to keep in mind is that errors that occur in event handlers, async code, or server-side rendering are not going to be caught by error boundaries where you have component did catch set up. So that's bit me in the past, and keep that in mind. And also, it only catches errors that occur in the children, not the component itself. So for composition notes, another shared improvisation, 3 series of panicked shutting down blasts. And finally, we've got, or not finally, but we've also got component will unmount. This is another shared improvisation. It's called OnlyOnce at the end of the component's life. And for the improvisation, we're looking for 3 series of one-breath improvisations. And each one should be a dramatic, comical exit, a flourishing bow or a curtsy. So. Awesome. The real trick to being a successful experimental composer is to get world-class musicians to show up. And so step 1, success. Programmatically, no parameters. This is a great place to do cleanup, get rid of event listeners, and validate timers, clear subscriptions. In my piece, this is where I'm getting rid of the WebSocket connections. Yeah, and then we'll do one more shared one, and then we'll get back to some other talking. And so render, this is our bread and butter. We want to return JSX. It's totally fine to use whatever kind of conditional statements you wanted to decide which JSX to use. And you want to avoid making network requests, doing other side effectful work. Setting state or triggering prop changes in parents is going to get you in trouble probably. The render methods that I like to see are just things that return JSX. I like to know where to go to look for my markup and keep it at that if possible. For composition, this is one of my favorite ones, but our performers are going to improvise around drones and overtones. During the piece, this will be a continuous improvisation, so I'll cue the start and the cutoff. Beautiful. Okay, so I think you can start to see how we're going to be painting a musical picture of the React application as it's running with these different textures. Real quickly, I'm going to return to another composer that's been very important to me, Frederick Rzewski. And so this is my quote. I don't try to set up enigmatic situations which will baffle people. I try to express whatever idea it is in a rational form. I don't try to make puzzles, but at the same time, I think it's interesting to put down your ideas in a way that may allow for not only a variety of possible readings at one time, but which may lead to other creative interpretations in the future you can't really foresee. And I thought about playing a game which is, was it an experimental composer that said it or a Rich Hickey quote? And I think that a lot of these, right? I mean, you could see talking about code this way, I'm not trying to set up abstractions to confuse people, but at the same time, I am thinking about the reusability of my code, right? And then we'll take a look at the score real quick. So this one looks a lot more similar to traditional Western music notation, right? We've got notes proceeding seemingly in order to end. But we've also got a lot of text here, which normally you don't see, certainly not handwritten like this. We'll take a look at this. So the first interesting thing is that the notes are to be read left to right, playing in an additive structure, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, till you get up to 65, and then you play it backwards in a subtractive structure. The next thing is that this is done starting at 8th note at 150, accelerating to 8th note at 300. So this is a pretty big clip, and it gets quicker and quicker and quicker. Next, there's instructions to always play loud, never stop or falter, and if you get lost, stay lost. Which is basically part of our onboarding for junior developers, right? I say that tongue-in-cheek, but actually this piece has failure built into it. The failure is not a bug, it's a feature. And as you're playing this, you can't help but get lost. But since the notes are written in such a way that it's largely pentatonic and simple melodies, these really beautiful canons break out that would be impossible to notate with traditional notation. And so if we look at this, this is basically true declarative notation and performance, because time has been completely removed from the equation. And the second thing that I would like to talk about is how this, in contrast to the Zorn piece, disrupts the hierarchical militaristic nature of the collaboration between the musicians. Everybody plays almost according to their own needs and what they have to give in return. And at the very end, everyone's asked to wait at the final position, and then you do this improvisation together. And for those who have played this, it's a transcendental experience after running through this very complex situation in your mind where you're trying to stay on track, you're trying to keep am I on number 63 and which one comes next? And as a musician, you're trained to try to catch up and join people, but you have to find your own tempo. It really is an example of marching in unity, but finding your own creative identity. And it's something that MX, that we've been experimenting with from the beginning in engineering in terms of just kind of telling people these are the broad-based goals. We're not going to do estimates. We're not going to do sprints. We're just going to pick up and start working where we think that we can have a really big impact on the company and our end users. And something kind of magical happens where even though there hasn't been somebody who's telling you what to do every day, at some point we get, when it's going right, we get things wrong too, but when it's going right, you get into this nice unstructured cadence with your coworkers, and there's an amount of trust that comes together that is really freeing. So let's get back to, and I have all this up on ryanmoore.party, so you can check it out, but let's go back to a couple of methods. So get derived state from props. This is a new one. We got two parameters, props and state. It's recommended to be rarely used, but it's out there, especially if you've been using component will mount. This is a good one to take into consideration. And I have a composition that comes along with this. This is a solo improvisation and is intended to be a preamble to the render, a sort of callback fanfare. So Steve, take it away. Nice. And then we're going to skip a couple here, and we're going to do should component update. From a programming perspective, two parameters, next props, next state, and basically you return false if you would like to encourage React not to call render and component did update, return true if you'd like to encourage them to. In my experience, this has been a really tricky one to get right, and we've had a lot of unexpected behavior, and part of it has been ignoring some of the advice that's given in the React docs, which says, like, only use this as a potential performance enhancement. Don't use it to prevent bugs that will occur if a render occurs. And you need to remember that the docs explicitly say that in the future, React may just treat this like a hint. So definitely don't bake this in to your application's core logic if you don't have to. From a composition standpoint, this is going to be a rhythmic exploration with punctuation recommended from Eric. Great. So I'm going to go ahead and move straight to get snapshot before update. So this is another new one. 2 parameters, previous props, previous state. Basically, sole use for this is to capture DOM information immediately before a render. The docs say that this is probably useful in chat-like applications where you need to really keep track of scroll position. Anything where you need fine-grained information about exactly what the state of DOM is, exactly before an update, this is what you're going to look for. And I'm going to introduce the programming notes of component did update because this gets the snapshot from the previous method as a result. And it's a great place to make network requests, do other effectful work, very similar to ComponentToMount, except you get it on every update. Watch out calling set state without conditional checks. And copying props to state here can lead to extra renders. I prefer to just avoid copying props to state where possible. If you got it in props, use it in props. From a composition standpoint, this is going to be a call and response from get snapshot before update to component did update. And we're going to have this is going to be Christian to Stuart. All right. So we're going to talk real quick about our final composer. This is Christian Wolff, and the piece is for 5 to 10. The quote is, "The other issue with these more open scores, like the prose collection, if you don't take that seriously, you're going to get a mess." And that's the kind of problem I've had, and caged repeatedly. People will figure, never mind the score, we'll just do something. And of course, it's not going to be any good. Usually, if something doesn't sound right in these open scores, I immediately go to a player and say, what is it that you're playing? Show me on the score what it is you're doing. And often they can't, or they haven't understood the notation. It turns out they totally misread the instructions. So that's an issue. But I haven't run across that for a while. Things have improved a lot. And now I'm going to show you the score example to see like how tricky this can be. So this looks pretty interesting, right? So these are actually little modules that a performer will look at, and they pay attention to sounds that are being made in the audience by other musicians, and they have very interesting meanings that are open to interpretation. But I think that, first off, it's really interesting. This looks to me like React component architecture, where each of these can basically be composed and shared among any part of the page. They can be reused. And they're little modules. Instead of taking in props and state and returning JSX, they take in prompts from the environment around them and return sound. So that's pretty exciting. But I also think that taking this kind of democratic cue of when juniors start, when I started programming, this is what most programming looked like to me, or may as well have. And when you have someone who's more experienced say, look, like, let's take a look at what the score means, and let's talk about what your understanding of what you're supposed to be contributing to the source. And it can be the difference between having somebody who engenders a lifelong love of code and experimental music like me, or somebody who's completely turned off of it, right? And a way that we can be inclusive. Okay, so let's take this last bit, and we're going to try to play this piece. So real quick, okay, we're working. If y'all can refresh. Basic architecture, React component, wrapping the other React component, logging the component lifecycle message to session storage with timestamps, then I'm throttling it so that it can be played back by the composers, publishing those updates in a second component to a WebSocket service that is then sending it back to iPads for them to play back. This first one is going to be the more common shared responsibility ones, and then we'll do another one with the others. Okay? So here I'm going to start. I'm going to refresh just to make sure. And I'm going to start. Right now we're actually logging these. We're going to hit an error, uh-oh, component to catch, and then we're going to move to playback. There we have it. World premiere. Okay, we're not going to do a full one with all of them because we're running to the end, but I want to at least give it a start. Once you start adding these other ones, this thing starts getting pretty long because these fire a lot. So we're going to go back here, trigger all of these, trigger a couple updates, and then, ready? Cut this one off. Okay, my other, thank you. Really appreciate your time. I hope this can give you a little bit of time to kind of think about how your code is organized, how your companies are organized, how your teams are organized, and look outside of the box, right? Just because things are the way they are doesn't mean this is the best that they can be, or even that it's good at all. And I think that that kind of mindset is how we got great technologies like React in the first place, and that all of us as members of the React community, as employees of our companies, we share a responsibility that our companies are the way that they are, and we need to use whatever privilege, power, responsibility that we have to transcend those systems when we can, and work to make them as best as they can when they can't. And thank you very much for your time. Thank you to my players, and have a good one.